This man feels that he can debunk the entire ancient Egyptian black theory, and he has what I think is the weakest evidence, but let's see if he's correct.
Hello again.
Hello?
I've heard a lot in the last few years about the idea of Black Egypt. I'm sure some viewers will have heard about this. According to this notion, ancient Egypt was a black civilization which bequeathed all kinds of things to the world, things from complex mathematics to the first written scripts and so on.
There's no way he has a problem with this idea, so let's see what he says.
To understand the truth about Egypt, we need to look at history, real history that is. And also, it won't do any harm if you glance at some modern discoveries in genetics, perhaps. Civilization, by which I mean cities, settled farming, writing, the use of the wheel, all sorts of things like that, arose in a part of the Middle East called the Fertile Crescent, which we can see here.
This is funny because it's incorrect. According to scientists today, farming began in multiple locations on Earth, and some even speculate it's 11 separate centers of origin. Let's read the study together. The beginnings of plant and animal domestication related to food production began globally 12 to 11,000 years ago at the end of most recent ice age and during the transition to the present interglacial period. Although often characterized as rapid and the result of explicit human intention, domestication is a complex process along a continuum of human, plant, and animal relationship that often took place over a long time period and was driven by a mixed ecological biological process encompassed a wide range of relationships from commensalism, mutualism to low-level management and direct control over reproduction, although these stages did not necessarily progress in a ratchet like fashion from wild to domestic. This is a map showing the areas where different plants and animals were tamed. Let's read it. A map deciphering likely centers where the domestication of at least one plant or animal took place. Black outlines surround the most widely accepted independent centers of domestication and sources of major diffusion of domesticates are indicated by arrows. Green and purple regions, respectively, are those where domestication process took place during the late Pleistocene to early Holocene transition, and in the middle of the Holocene, brown regions represent areas where at present the evidence for domestication is interpreted based upon these regions found outside of their native distribution to those listed. Additional detail and references associated with each region and so there you have it, multiple regions for farming that then coalesced. And even today, we have different ideas of farming from different regions. And again, independent, as the study says, not all coming from the crescent.
Egypt's part of the Fertile Crescent, of course, the long curving band of agriculture fringed by desert and wild land. Many of the people here spoke Semitic languages and they spread out. Some of them founded colonies in Africa, for example, Carthage and Ethiopia.
Carthage is a more modern civilization than the ancient Ethiopian farmers who first entered, so I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
Were Semitic colonies. Ancient Egyptians looked a bit like this.
It's very brave of him to put up this image as an opposition to black Africans being Egyptians, considering the fact that if anybody looked at these and if you told someone, hey, look, these are black people, I just drew them, no one would go, oh, they look nothing like black people. They look exactly like black people. They look like goddamn Nigerians. To further illustrate this point, let me show a ancient Egyptian who's as old as any other, 2600 BC. Look at those facial features. Would you describe them as European?
The motive that some black people have for claiming that ancient Egypt was an indigenous black civilization is quite simple. If it were true, and it's not, it would mean that writing, complex mathematics, building in stone, medicine, all sorts of other things are really black inventions, and that our civilization in Europe and America is founded on black enterprise and black inventions, a black civilization.
So, what about that would be a problem?
I mean, there's no evidence to support this. One piece of evidence, which has been quoted a number of times here, is the Greek historian Herodotus, who described Egyptians as being black-faced.
First, he says there's no evidence, and now he's about to present evidence. That's good.
And from that, some people have assumed that means that they were actually black in the modern sense, as in black Africans. It's not really so, though. It just means that the people from the Middle East were a bit darker than Europeans. And often Europeans describe people in a few shades darker than them as being black, having black faces.
Here's some evidence that he didn't just call them black faced, but he also had other comparisons with Egyptians and Ethiopians to prove that they're one group. He says, for the Colchians were evidently Egyptians, and I say this having myself observed it before I heard it from others. And as it was a matter of interest to me, I inquired of both people, and the Colchians had more recollection of the Egyptians than the Egyptians had of the Colchians. Yet the Egyptians said that they thought the Colchians were descended from the army of Cesaris. And I formed my conjecture not only because they are swarthy and curly headed, for this amounts to nothing because others are so likewise, but chiefly from the following circumstances, because the Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians are the only nations of the world who from the first have practiced circumcision, for the Phoenicians and the Syrians in Palestine acknowledge that they learned the custom from the Egyptians. So here you have an obvious trail where a man at the time is Herodotus is looking deeper into the connection between Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians and saying that their culture is even similar outside of the fact that they're swarthy, meaning black.
It probably will surprise nobody to learn that Rudyard Kipling is my favourite poet, and I know many of his poems off by heart. This will give us a modern example of the use of black-faced to describe people that aren't actually black, just a little bit darker than the person speaking. Kipling wrote a poem called Gunga Din, which some of you may have heard of. And some of the opening lines that introduce Gunga Din run like this. In India's sunny clime, where I used to spend my time, a serving of Her Majesty the Queen, of all that black-faced crew, the finest man I knew was our regimental bistie, Gunga Din. Now, Kipling uses black-faced crew to describe people from South Asia, people we've now described as Indians and Pakistanis. They're not black, obviously. He says black-faced crew.
This one is just downright sneaky. Saying that people from India are not black faced in the same way that black Africans are black faced is ridiculous. You can clearly see that these people have the same skin color as black Africans. So it's not slightly different, it's completely different. But sneakily, he tries to push Indians as if they're just, they're just a tad browner than the white people. Middle Eastern people aren't even this brown.
Exactly what Herodotus was doing when he described the Egyptians in similar terms as being black-faced. He just meant they were a bit darker than he was. Now, let's look at some archaeological evidence. The ancient Egyptians painted themselves and those painted pictures of people from other nations around them quite often, and it's revealing. When they painted themselves as copper coloured, which they were, like most of the people in the Fertile Crescent, certainly darker than white Europeans, but not black. When
This is another lie. Clearly, the Egyptians didn't depict themselves as light skinned as the Asians.
they wanted to show black Africans, the Nubians say, they painted them as black and they made them look very much like black sub-Saharan Africans to show the difference between them and the black people, to distinguish between them and the Nubians. Here's some paintings that they did. The most interesting evidence about the people that lived in ancient Egypt is that provided by the extraction of DNA from 151 Egyptian mummies 2 or 3 years ago. The sample covered about 1300 years, right up to the Roman period. I'll give a link to the research of this in the description of this video.
The study that he's talking about takes place in the Fayoum, and as you can see, most people who came from foreign regions landed in the Fayoum because it's closer to Asia and Europe. And the genetic test that he's talking about doesn't say that there was no African DNA. In fact, it says that the absolute estimates are 6 to 15% sub-Saharan African DNA, meaning that modern Egyptians have more sub-Saharan, but not zero, for the ancient ones. By the way, these DNA tests are only in the late period, and again, they take place in an area where you would expect to find foreigners.
Like, straight off, we can see that no DNA at all was found from sub-Saharan Africa.
That's another lie. The absolute estimates show 6 to 15% sub-Saharan African, not zero.
The strongest connections and associations that were found in the DNA were with the rest of the Fertile Crescent, right up into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. The people in Egypt interbred cheerfully with the Semitic tribes of the Fertile Crescent, the ancestors of the Arabs and Jews, but not at all with black Africans.
Considering how early Mentuhotep married Nubian women from Nubia, like Kemsit and Kawat and these other queens, it's impossible to say that there was never any Nubian admixture in the Egyptian race. Especially since Nubian dancing girls were like one of the most popular things that came from Nubia to Egypt.
This, at a stroke, blows the Black Egypt idea right out of the water.
Unfortunately, that's the best we can hope from this guy. Conjecture and skin manipulation and misreading genetic studies.
All these people had a common culture in which black people had little or no part. Let's say the people from the Fertile Crescent that we can see here.
I wasn't going to attack him with this type of comparison, but seeing that he put them on the screen, I must. Now, in your own brain, when you look at these two people, do they look like they belong to the same race? The self-awareness is evidence. The short hair of the Egyptians, the long hair of the Assyrians, the small lips of the Assyrians, the big lips of the Egyptians, the broad nose of the Egyptians, the sharp nose of the Assyrians. They just don't look alike at all.
Of course, it also means that most European civilization had its origins as well in the Fertile Crescent. It's no coincidence that people commenting on YouTube use a modified form of the Hebrew alphabet to make their comments. Anybody from the Christian West is following a culture founded in the thoroughly Semitic world of the Fertile Crescent.
While it's true that the ancient Middle Eastern languages eventually became the Greco and Italian languages, the Egyptian languages look nothing like those.
It just occurs to me that I've probably upset and annoyed more than just black people who hold Afrocentric views of history. I've probably also put out of countenance white anti-Semites. It must be very frustrating if you want to make digs about Jews on the internet and then find that you've got to use a similar alphabet to that in which the Talmud is written. Still, I can't please everybody, I suppose.
In conclusion, no matter what you think of the ancient Egyptians, whether you think that they were white, black, or Middle Eastern, really doesn't matter. The arguments that were put up in this video are lackluster at best, and they're easily refutable, or at least easy to make look pointless.